The Galactic Council chamber stretched across 3 kilometers of polished crystal and floating platforms, a monument to 10,000 years of peaceful cooperation among the stars. And today, it buzzed with curiosity rather than the usual diplomatic tedium that characterized most sessions. Ambassador Maria Chen stood in the center of the speaking platform, her small human frame dwarfed by the towering representatives of species that had conquered the cosmos, while humanity still painted on cave walls. And she smiled with genuine warmth at the assembled delegates. The Kryn War Master Thaxis observed the human with what his species considered a restrained amusement, though his forearms crossed in a gesture that other species recognized as dismissive. His exoskeleton gleamed like polished obsidian under the chamber's ambient light, and his compound eyes tracked every movement the fragile creature made. The species designation Homo sapiens requests full membership in the Galactic Council, Chen announced in clear galactic standard, her accent strange but understandable, and her eyes swept across the assembled representatives with an earnestness that some found endearing and others found naive. The Vex representative, a crystalline being whose thoughts manifested as colored light patterns within its transparent body, pulsed with pale yellow amusement and transmitted its assessment directly to the Council database, where all members could access the information simultaneously. The preliminary report on humanity, made for entertaining reading, and painted a picture of a species so fundamentally unsuited for survival that their very existence seemed like a cosmic accident. Humans possessed no natural armor, no venom, no enhanced sensory capabilities, and their fragile bodies could be terminated by the simplest atmospheric variations. Your world, the Thelrosi diplomat gurgled through its translation device, its tentacles undulating in what might have been concern or condescension, is classified as a Class 7 death world, which means your own planet actively attempts to terminate your existence on a daily basis. Yet you seem remarkably cheerful about this fact. Chen's smile never wavered, and she nodded with enthusiasm that seemed out of place in the formal setting of galactic politics. And when she spoke, her voice carried genuine excitement, rather than the calculated tones most species employed in diplomatic settings. Earth has its challenges, she admitted freely, spreading her hands in a gesture of openness. But those challenges made us who we are, and we're grateful for the opportunity to join the wider galactic community and learn from species with so much more experience than we possess. The assembled delegates exchanged glances through various sensory organs, and a collective assessment formed without need for verbal communication among the elder species. These humans were innocent, perhaps dangerously so, and completely unaware of how harsh the galaxy could be. Comathaxis leaned forward on his platform, his mandibles clicking in a pattern that suggested paternal concern mixed with superiority, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had fought in countless conflicts. Across multiple star systems, the galaxy is not as peaceful as you might hope, he said, his tone gentle by Kryn standards, though it still rumbled like distant thunder. And there are threats beyond your current comprehension, which means your species requires protection rather than partnership at this developmental stage. The other delegates murmured agreement through various communication methods, and the consensus formed quickly, as it often did when dealing with newly discovered species who lacked the technology or wisdom to navigate galactic politics. Chen listened carefully and made notes on a primitive datapad rather than using neural interfaces like more advanced species. And when the Kryn finished speaking, she nodded with understanding that suggested she expected this outcome. "We understand your concerns," she replied, her voice steady and respectful, "and we appreciate the Council's wisdom in these matters. So we will accept whatever status you deem appropriate for our species at this time." The vote proceeded with bureaucratic efficiency, and the result surprised no one familiar with Council protocols regarding newly discovered species. Earth would receive protected status, which meant the planet and its solar system would be declared off-limits to exploitation or colonization. However, the protection came with significant restrictions that would prevent humanity from developing military technologies or expanding beyond their own solar system without Council supervision. And the Kryn would assign guardians to monitor the humans and protect them from external threats. Kessel, accepted the decision with grace that impressed even the most cynical delegates, and she thanked the council for their consideration with genuine gratitude that seemed almost childlike. In its sincerity, we will honor these restrictions, she promised, her hand over her heart in a human gesture of oath-taking. And we look forward to the day when we can contribute meaningfully to the galactic community. As the human delegation departed the chamber, walking rather than floating or teleporting as more advanced species did. Thaxis watched them with something approaching fondness mixed with pity. They will not survive long. The Vex representative pulsed in private communication to the Kryn War Master, its crystalline form flickering with colors that indicated certainty. Their world will consume them before they develop sufficient technology to escape it. Thaxis rumbled agreement, though something about the humans' eager optimism had touched even his battle-hardened sensibilities, and he volunteered to personally oversee the Guardian assignment to their system. At least we can ensure their final years are peaceful, he transmitted back, his thoughts colored with genuine sympathy for these doomed innocents. The council moved on to other business, and Earth became another entry in the vast database of protected species, filed alongside dozens of other primitive civilizations that required supervision and safeguarding from the dangers of galactic civilization back on Earth. Chen stood in the United Nations Assembly and delivered her report to the gathered representatives of humanity's governments, and her expression remained carefully neutral as she outlined the council's decision. They have accepted our application. Out. And polite applause rippled through the chamber before she raised her hand for silence. But we have been designated a protected species, which means we are restricted to our own solar system and forbidden from developing military technologies. The applause died, and murmurs of concern replaced celebration. But Chen's next words carried an edge that hadn't been present in the council chambers, and her smile took on a quality that suggested she understood more than she had revealed. However, she continued, her voice carrying clearly through the vast assembly hall. They have only forbidden military development outside our solar system, which means what we do within Sol remains our own business. The assembled leaders of humanity leaned forward in their seats, and understanding began to dawn across faces from every continent and culture, and Chen's smile widened as she delivered the final assessment. They think we're innocent, she said quietly, though her words carried to every corner of the chamber through the audio system. So let us be innocent, but let us also be prepared, because history has taught us that innocence without preparation is just another word for victim. The assembly erupted with discussion and debate, but beneath the surface chaos, a consensus formed with surprising speed among people who rarely agreed on anything. Humanity would smile and accept protection while quietly building strength. They would honor the letter of the council's restrictions while preparing for the day when protection might fail or prove insufficient, and they would do it all behind the facade of grateful innocence who knew their place in the galactic ordering orbit above Earth. A Kryn Guardian ship took up position and began its long watch over the primitive species below, and its crew settled in for what they anticipated would be a boring assignment, protecting harmless creatures from dangers. They couldn't even imagine, they had no idea that below them, humanity had just begun the most comprehensive military preparation in their violent history, and that 50 years would prove sufficient. Time to transform innocence into something the galaxy had never encountered. Protected species had accepted their cage with grace and gratitude, but they had also begun building tools that would eventually shatter those bars. When the time came for humanity to reveal what innocence had been hiding all along, 50 years passed like water flowing through the vast time span of galactic civilization. And to the elder species, this represented barely a moment worth noting in their long histories. But for humanity, these 5 decades transformed everything about their place in the cosmos. Commander Thaxis rotated through his assignment, guarding Earth with mechanical regularity, spending 3-year shifts watching over the humans before returning to more interesting posts. And each time he returned, he noted the species had built more stations and expanded further through their solar system. The humans had constructed sprawling cities on Luna, where they mined resources and conducted research in the low-gravity environment, and their Mars colonies grew from small outposts to settlements housing millions who terraformed the red planet with patient determination. Thaxis found their progress charming in the way one might appreciate a child's drawing, technically impressive for their development level, but ultimately insignificant compared to the wonders the elder species had achieved. And his reports to the council noted humanity's peaceful development with approval. They focus on art and science. He transmitted in one routine update, his compound eyes reviewing data streams from monitoring satellites, and show no interest in weapons development or expansion beyond their designated boundaries, which confirms the protected status remains appropriate. Earth's music and literature had begun spreading through galactic networks and found an enthusiastic audience among species who appreciated the emotional depth humans brought to creative expression. And their scientific papers contributed novel perspectives that occasionally sparked interesting discussions. Vex particularly enjoyed human philosophical works and found their contradictory nature fascinating. The way humans could simultaneously believe in peace while their history dripped with violence. And this paradox entertained crystalline intellects that had long ago resolved such contradictions. Ambassador Chen had retired after 30 years, and her successor, Ambassador Zhang, continued the policy of grateful cooperation with council directives, always thanking the Kryn Guardians for their protection and never pushing against the restrictions that kept humanity caged. The galaxy had almost forgotten Earth represented anything other than a successful example of the protected species program working exactly as intended, and life continued in peaceful routine for the thousands of civilizations that made up the council. Then the Vracs arrived from the void between galaxies, and everything changed in ways that would reshape the known universe and reveal truths about humanity that had been hiding in plain sight. The first warning came from observation posts in the galactic rim, where council species maintained monitoring stations to watch for extragalactic threats. And the initial reports seemed like equipment malfunctions, because nothing that massive should exist. Entire star systems went dark as something consumed them. Not just planets, but stars themselves vanishing from sensor arrays. And refugee ships began fleeing toward the galactic core with tales of horror that seemed impossible. The Vrak swarm numbered in the trillions. Biological ships that moved with coordinated precision, guided by a hive intelligence that made individual decision-making irrelevant, and they consumed everything in their path to fuel their endless expansion. Council defense fleets moved to intercept and were annihilated with terrifying efficiency, their advanced shields and weapons proving ineffective against an enemy that adapted to every tactic within minutes. And panic began spreading through civilizations that had known only peace. Kryn mobilized their warrior fleets, and the Vex calculated optimal defense strategies, while the Thelrosi coordinated evacuation of outer rim worlds. But every projection showed the same inevitable conclusion, and the Varax would reach the galactic core. Then 5 standard years worlds that had stood for millennia were abandoned as entire populations fled toward the interior. And the refugee crisis overwhelmed council resources as billions sought shelter from the approaching annihilation. Thaxis received recall orders along with every other Kryn Guardian assigned to protected species posts, because every warrior was needed at the front lines where the swarm consumed world after world. And he plotted course for Earth to inform the humans their protection was ending. His ship dropped into Earth's orbit, and he transmitted a priority meeting request to the human government. And Ambassador Zhang appeared on his view screen within minutes, looking concerned but composed. Commander Thaxis. Zhang greeted him with the warm smile humans habitually displayed. It is good to see you, though I suspect this is not a social visit, given the concerning reports we have been monitoring. Thaxis appreciated that the human acknowledged the situation directly, and he respected efficiency, even in doomed species. So he delivered his message without diplomatic. Softening the council faces an existential threat, he stated bluntly, his mandibles clicking with stress patterns he couldn't fully suppress. And all resources must be redirected to fighting the Vrak swarm, which means protected species can no longer receive Guardian oversight or evacuation assistance. Zhang's expression shifted, and something flickered in his eyes that Thaxis couldn't quite interpret. Perhaps fear, or perhaps something else entirely. And the human leader nodded slowly. We understand, Zhang replied after a moment of consideration, and we appreciate the council's honesty in this difficult situation. But before you go, Commander, I must ask one question. Thaxis gestured for him to continue, and checked his chronometer because he needed to depart soon if he wanted to reach the mustering point before the next Vrax assault began. May we help? Zhang asked simply, his voice carrying none of the fear Thaxis expected from a species facing abandonment and almost certain extinction. The question struck Thaxis as so absurd, he almost laughed, his warrior instincts finding dark humor in the innocent offer. And he struggled to frame a response that wouldn't seem cruel. The Vrax have destroyed battle fleets that could sterilize your entire world in minutes, he said gently, trying to spare the humans' feelings while being realistic. And your species lacks military infrastructure or combat experience? So I fear there is nothing you could contribute beyond becoming additional casualties. Zhang smiled, and the expression held something Thaxis had never seen in the human diplomat before. A confidence that seemed out of place, given the circumstances. And his next words carried absolute certainty, Commander. You have been very kind to us these 50 years, and we are grateful for your protection. Zhang said carefully, choosing each word with precision. But you may be surprised by what we can contribute if you give us the opportunity. Thaxis wanted to argue, but time pressure forced him to cut the conversation short, and he transmitted coordinates for the Council's emergency headquarters in case. The humans somehow survived and needed to seek refuge if you live through what comes, Thaxis said, genuine sadness coloring his transmission. You will be welcome among the survivors, and perhaps we can maintain friendship even if we could not maintain protection. The Kryn commander's ship accelerated out of the solar system, toward battles that would determine whether galactic civilization continued to exist, and behind him, Earth continued its routine activities as if nothing had changed. The Axis ported the conversation to his superiors and included a note praising the humans' courage in the face of inevitable doom. Their offer to help touching, even though it came from ignorance rather than capability. Council made note of humanity's situation and filed them among the thousands of protected species that would likely perish in the coming years. Unfortunate casualties of a threat to vast to prevent an Earth. Zhang called an emergency session of the United Earth Government, and his smile vanished as he addressed the assembled leaders with cold efficiency that would have shocked the Kryn. The Varax have forced the Council to recall our guardians, he announced, without preamble, which means our cage is now open and our restrictions are effectively meaningless. So, I am authorizing activation of all contingency protocols. Immediately, the assembly erupted with controlled chaos as orders went out to military installations hidden throughout the solar system. In 50 years of careful preparation began converting into active deployment with practiced efficiency, shipyards that built peaceful research vessels retooled in hours to military production, and millions of soldiers who had trained in secret prepared for deployment, and weapons systems tested in deep space activated across every human colony. Zhang watched the deployment begin and thought about Commander Thaxis flying toward battles the Kryn expected to lose. And he hoped the warrior would survive long enough to see what humanity had been building they think were innocent, Zhang muttered to himself, echoing Chen's words from 50 years ago. So let's show them what innocent really means. The Vrax swarm moved through the outer territories like a living tsunami of biomechanical horror, consuming everything in their path with the efficiency of a machine and the hunger of a biological organism. And Council worlds fell faster than evacuation fleets could save their populations. Commander Thaxis fought in the Third Battle of Arcturus, where 12 Kryn war fleets attempted to hold a critical junction point that connected 17 inhabited systems, and he watched in horror as Vrax adaptive protocols rendered their weapons increasingly ineffective. The crystalline Vex had calculated optimal firing patterns and defensive formations, but mathematics proved useless against an enemy that evolved countermeasures faster than tactics could be updated, and the battle ended in retreat despite numerical advantage. Refugee streams clogged every major hyperspace lane, and Council evacuation protocols collapsed under the sheer volume of displaced populations, while governments that had maintained peace for millennia began fragmenting under pressure. The Thalrosi attempted diplomatic contact with the Vrax and were consumed without response, which confirmed what the Vex had already calculated from Behavioral analysis and the swarm possess no interest in. Communication Theus returned to his flagship between battles and reviewed tactical reports that painted an increasingly desperate picture, and his compound eyes tracked data streams showing inexorable Vrax advancement toward the galactic core. Something impossible appeared in the tactical displays, and a Vrax fleet simply vanished from all sensors near the outer rim. Not destroyed because destruction left debris signatures, but gone as if it had never existed, though. Council Intelligence Division analyzed the disappearance and found no explanation that fit known physics or observed Vrax behavior. And speculation ranged from internal swarm conflicts to unknown fourth-party intervention. Second, Vrax contingent diverted to investigate the First Fleet's last known position and transmitted coordinates before all communications ceased. And the location made Thaxus's blood run cold, despite his exoskeleton maintaining constant temperature. Coordinates placed both vanished Vrax fleets near Sol system, where humanity huddled on their primitive worlds waiting for extinction. And Thaxus felt certainty settle in his gut that the humans had somehow angered the swarm they died fighting. He transmitted to the Council with genuine sorrow, which honors their species, even if it proves futile, and I request permission to lead a memorial expedition to document their final stand. The Council granted permission because documenting extinct species had ceremonial importance in galactic culture, and Thaxus diverted 3 Kryn scout ships to investigate what he expected would be a debris field where Earth once orbited his. Ships dropped into normal space at the edge of Sol system, and sensors immediately registered active combat in the asteroid belt. Massive energy signatures and kinetic exchanges that suggested major fleet engagement, and Thaxus ordered maximum magnification on visual arrays. What the cameras revealed made no sense according to everything Thaxus knew about humanity and their technological limitations, because the battle unfolding before his sensors showed human warships dancing through Vrax formations with impossible precision. That human vessels moved like nothing Thaxus had ever seen in 4 centuries of warfare, their acceleration curves violating what he thought were physical limits for biological crews, and their maneuvering showed prediction algorithms that bordered on precognition. Vrax bioships attempted to swarm human vessels, using standard, overwhelming tactics that had worked against every Council species. But the humans simply weren't where the Vrax expected them to be. And weapons fire passed through empty space, then the humans fired back, and Thaxus watched in stunned silence as human weapons demonstrated lethality that seemed impossible from their technological base. Because kinetic rounds accelerated to relativistic speeds tore through Vrax hulls like paper-massive laser arrays that drew power from what appeared to be miniaturized fusion reactors carved through swarm formations. And the humans deployed something Thaxus had never encountered in galactic warfare, and weaponized gravity wells that crushed Vrax ships at the molecular level impossible. He transmitted automatically, his warrior's mind struggling to process tactics that violated every assumption about human capabilities. They have no military infrastructure and no combat experience, according to all reports, his tactical officer, younger Kryn named Vexus, highlighted additional contacts on the display and expanded the view to show human soldiers boarding damaged Vrax vessels. And what happened next defied everything the Kryn understood about infantry combat. Human boarding parties moved through Vrax bioships with coordinated lethality that suggested neural linking or hive mind coordination. But humans possessed neither capability, according to Council knowledge, and their tactics demonstrated understanding of Vrax interior layouts. Vrax had never encountered boarding actions because most species found the idea of entering enemy vessels suicidal, but humans seemed to consider it standard procedure, and they cleared ship sections with brutal efficiencies. Watched a human squad encounter a Vrax warrior form 3 times. Their size with natural weapons that could cut through most armor, and instead of retreating, the humans executed a flanking maneuver that ended with the Vrax creature dead in seconds. They're using combined arms doctrine. Vexus observed with awe in his transmission. Infantry supporting fleet operations, while fleet provides covering fire for boarding parties, and their coordination suggests they've drilled these maneuvers thousands of times. The battle concluded within 3 hours, and the Vrax fleet that had numbered over 200 bioships was reduced to expanding debris clouds. While human casualties appeared minimal based on ship counts and observed damage, Thaxis ordered his ships to transmit Council identification codes and requested communication with human command, his mind racing with questions that demanded answers. And he needed to understand what he had witnessed. A human appeared on his view screen. A woman wearing military uniform that Thaxis had never seen before because humans weren't supposed to have military forces, and her expression combined professional courtesy with barely suppressed satisfaction. Commander Thaxis. She greeted him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. This is Admiral Sarah Rodriguez of the United Earths Defense Fleet, and welcome to Sol System. Though I apologize for the mess we're making of your arrival, Thaxis struggled to formulate questions from the thousands flooding his mind, and finally settled on the most fundamental issue that needed addressing. Because everything else depended on understanding this basic fact, you have a military, he stated, the words coming out almost accusatory despite his attempt at diplomatic neutrality. And not just defensive forces, but a fully developed war fleet with training and doctrine that suggests decades of preparation. Rodriguez nodded, and her smile widened slightly. And something in her expression reminded Thaxis of veterans he had known who carried secrets from campaigns they couldn't discuss. We have always had a military commander, she replied calmly, her tone suggesting she was explaining something obvious to someone who should have known better. And we have been preparing for this exact scenario since the day Ambassador Chen accepted protected status 50 years ago. The revelation hit Thaxis like a kinetic round, and he reviewed 5 decades of reports from Kryn Guardians who had monitored Earth. All the peaceful development and cultural expansion and scientific research that seemed to confirm humanity's innocent nature. The restrictions, he began. Understanding dawning with uncomfortable clarity, forbid military development outside your solar system. But you honored that restriction while building everything we're seeing now within Sol itself. Rodriguez's smile became genuine, and she spread her hands in a gesture of openness that reminded Thaxis of Ambassador Chen making promises in the council chambers half-century ago. We honored every restriction the council placed upon us, she confirmed, her voice carrying emphasis on the word honored that suggested pride in following rules precisely. And we accepted your protection gratefully because we needed time to prepare. Thaxis felt something shift in his understanding of humanity and realized the species he had pitied and protected had been studying galactic civilization while building weapons specifically designed to fight threats the council couldn't handle. Why, he asked, the question encompassing everything from human motivation to their apparent paranoia about military preparation. Did you prepare for war when you had no enemies and existed under council protection? Rodriguez's expression sobered, and she looked directly at Thaxis through the view screen. And when she spoke, her words carried weight that suggested they came from hard-learned lessons. Because we have been innocent before, Commander, she said quietly. And we paid for that innocence in blood millions of times throughout our history. So we learned that peace without preparation is just another word for victim. The council convened an emergency session within hours of Thaxis transmitting his report from Sol System, and the crystalline Vex projected data streams that showed human fleet capabilities, while the Thelrosi delegation rippled with agitation. This represents a fundamental violation of protected status protocols. The Vex senior analyst pulsed in colors that indicated severe concern mixed with fascination. And humanity has been preparing for warfare while maintaining the appearance of peaceful development. Thaxis stood before the assembled council and defended the humans. Despite regulations that should trigger immediate sanctions, because he had watched them fight and understood what their capabilities meant for galactic survival, they violated the letter of no restriction, he argued, his forearms gesturing emphatically while his mandibles clicked with passionate certainty. And every Guardian report confirms they built nothing beyond their solar system boundary. So technically, they honored our agreement, the Thelrosi representative gurgled. Disagreement, through its translation device and its tentacles, formed patterns that suggested betrayal and anger. And several other council species transmitted support for imposing sanctions. The spirit of protected status requires species to remain peaceful, it argued. And building the military infrastructure we observed demonstrates hostile intent, regardless of technical compliance. Before the debate could continue, Admiral Rodriguez requested permission to address the council and appeared via holographic projection in the center of the chamber. And her presence silenced the arguing delegates. Honored council, she began formally, her military bearing impressive even to species who had fought for millennia. Humanity understands your concerns, and we apologize for any deception our actions. This might suggest. She paused, and her expression shifted from formal apology to something harder. And when she continued, her voice carried absolute conviction that brooked no argument. However, we will not apologize for preparing to defend ourselves and our allies, she stated clearly, because history taught us that survival requires strength, and we chose to build that strength within the boundaries you established. The Vex representative pulsed with colors, indicating it wanted to speak, and Rodriguez yielded the floor with a gesture of respect. And the crystalline being's transmission carried curiosity rather than accusation. Your fleet demonstrates capabilities that required decades of focused development, it observed, which means you began this preparation immediately after receiving protected status. And we find ourselves wondering why you anticipated needing such forces. Rodriguez smiled, and the expression held no warmth. Just the cold calculation of someone who had studied galactic history and drawn uncomfortable conclusions about peaceful civilizations your council has maintained. Peace for 10,000 years, she replied. But that peace was purchased through an overwhelming force that prevented conflict. And we noticed that force was concentrated in species like the Kryn, who value warrior traditions. Thaxis felt recognition stir in his consciousness and understood where the human was heading with her analysis, because she was describing the fundamental truth that maintained council stability. When we studied your civilization, Rodriguez continued, we saw that peace exists because strong species protect weaker ones, and we realized that protection could fail if something threatened the strong species themselves. The chamber fell silent as delegates processed this observation, and many realized the humans had understood galactic power dynamics better than species who had participated in them. For millennia, the Variks prove our assessment correct, Rodriguez concluded, because your warrior species cannot defeat them using conventional tactics, which means protected species like humanity would be abandoned to save core populations. The brutal honesty of her words struck the council like a physical blow, and several species transmitted objections while others grudgingly acknowledged the accuracy of her prediction. Ambassador Zhang appeared beside Rodriguez and took over the presentation, and his diplomatic skills smoothed some of the harsh edges from the admiral's military bluntness. We do not blame the council for this situation, he said gently, because any rational civilization would prioritize survival of the majority over protection of peripheral populations, and we understand the mathematics that drive such decisions. He gestured, and holographic displays showed human fleet movements coordinating with council forces, and the tactical projections demonstrated how human capabilities could support defensive operations. We offer our assistance freely, Zhang continued, not because we expect the council to apologize or because we demand recognition, but because the Variks threaten everyone and humanity believes in standing together against extinction. The Thelrosi representative rippled with what might have been shame or perhaps grudging respect, and its tentacles formed a pattern that requested permission to speak. If we accept your assistance, it gurgled. What guarantees can you provide that humanity will not use these military capabilities against council members once the VAX threat ends? Rodriguez and Zhang exchanged glances, and something passed between them that suggested they had anticipated this question. And Rodriguez answered with the directness that seemed to characterize human military culture. We can provide no guarantees, because guarantees are meaningless between species that can build planet-killing weapons. And trust must be earned through actions rather than promised through words. The honesty of her response surprised the council because most species would offer elaborate assurances, but humans seemed to prefer acknowledging uncomfortable truths. And Thaxis found himself appreciating their approach. However, Zhang added, humanity has no interest in conquest or domination, and we would prefer to join the council as equals who contribute to collective security rather than remain isolated within our solar system. The debate continued for hours as council members argued about accepting help from a species that had technically deceived them. And projections showed the Variks advancing steadily toward core worlds. Finally, the Kryn High Commander, Thaxis' superior officer, transmitted a statement that cut through the political maneuvering with warrior pragmatism. The Vraks do not care about our regulations or our wounded pride, he stated bluntly. And they will consume us while we debate whether to accept help from species we underestimated. So I propose we accept human assistance and address political concerns after we survive. The vote passed with narrow majority, and humanity received authorization to deploy forces beyond Sol system for the first time in their membership. And Rodriguez immediately began coordinating with Council. Military Commander Taxis volunteered to serve as liaison between human forces and Kryn fleets, and he transported to the human flagship Endurance to observe their operations firsthand. Ship's interior demonstrated technology that seemed impossible given humanity's supposed development level, and the crew moved with practiced efficiency that spoke of years training together. And Thaxis noticed details he had missed during the battle every human wore, advanced armor even while performing routine duties. And combat drills ran constantly throughout the ship, with crew rotating through exercises. And he realized the entire vessel was designed around the assumption of being boarded. Rodriguez gave him a tour and explained human tactical philosophy while they walked through corridors that could be sealed and defended section by section, and her words revealed thinking that went far beyond conventional warfare. We assume the enemy will adapt, she explained, which means we prepare backup plans for our backup plans. And we train every crew member to fight because you never know who will need to hold a position. They reached the bridge, and Thaxis observed human officers coordinating fleet movements through neural interfaces, combined with verbal confirmation protocols, and the redundancy seemed excessive until he understood humans didn't trust single points of failure. Your species fought itself for most of your history, he observed, reviewing data Chen had provided during the initial council application. And that experience shaped everything about how you approach conflict. Rodriguez nodded, and her expression turned distant, as if remembering lessons learned through personal loss. And when she spoke, her words carried the weight of species-wide trauma. We killed each other with every weapon we could imagine, she confirmed quietly. And we nearly destroyed ourselves dozens of times before we finally learned to cooperate. So we understand warfare in ways that peaceful species cannot. She looked at Thaxis directly, and her next words seemed to carry a warning that went beyond the current situation. And he understood she was explaining something fundamental about humanity. We are not warriors pretending to be peaceful, she said carefully. And we are peaceful people who become exceptional warriors when necessary. Because we learn the hard way that sometimes violence is the only language predators understand. Thaxis processed this distinction and realized it explained everything about human behavior, from their acceptance of protected status to their current deployment. And they had never lied about their nature. The galaxy will need to adjust its assessment of humanity, he transmitted with certainty, because you are not the innocent species we believed we were protecting. The human defense fleet emerged from Sol system like a swarm of metallic predators. Thousands of warships that had been built and hidden throughout the solar system during 50 years of careful preparation, and their deployment shocked Council observers who couldn't comprehend the Admiral Rodriguez commanded from the Endurance while coordinating with dozens of other flag officers who led battle groups named after old Earth nations and historical conflicts. And their communication protocols demonstrated organization that most species required centuries to develop. The Vraks detected the new fleet and diverted forces to intercept what they calculated would be another easy victory like the dozens they had already achieved. And their hive intelligence analyzed human ship signatures with algorithmic certainty. Commander Thaxis watched from the Endurance bridge as Vraks bioships maneuvered into standard swarm formations that had overwhelmed Kryn battle fleets. And he transmitted tactical advice based on hard-won experience fighting the enemy. They will attempt to overwhelm your point defense with numerical superiority, he warned, his compound eyes tracking the approaching swarm forces, and then close to boarding range where their warrior forms hold advantage. Rodriguez nodded appreciation for the information and issued orders that sent human ships into formations that looked nothing like conventional council tactics. And Thaxis watched with growing fascination as the strategy unfolded. The human fleet didn't form defensive walls or attempt to hold ground in space. Instead, They moved in three-dimensional patterns that seemed chaotic until he recognized what they were doing. And it was beautiful and terrifying. We're not trying to stop them, Rodriguez explained, because stopping a swarm is impossible. So instead, we're going to break their coordination and force them to fight as individuals rather than a collective. The first engagement demonstrated what she meant, and human ships fired kinetic rounds that passed through Vrax formations without hitting anything critical. But the rounds carried electromagnetic pulse generators that disrupted swarm communication protocols. Ships suddenly found themselves unable to coordinate with neighbors in their hive. Intelligence fractured into thousands of individual units trying to follow outdated orders. And the humans exploited this confusion with ruthless efficiency. Human torpedo boats, small craft that seemed suicidal in their close approach, launched weapons that targeted Vrax bioship nervous systems with tailored neurotoxins. And the enemy vessels convulsed as their organic components rebelled against control systems. Meanwhile, larger human cruisers deployed gravity mines that created localized space-time distortions. And Vrax ships that relied on organic sensors to navigate found themselves pulled into collision courses they couldn't avoid. Thaxis watched the battle unfold like a masterclass in asymmetric warfare and realized humans had studied the VAX for months since the swarm first appeared, analyzing every engagement and developing specific countermeasures. You're not fighting them the way they expect, he observed, because you identified their assumption that enemies would use conventional tactics and then deliberately violated every standard approach. Rodriguez grinned, and the expression reminded Thaxis of predators he had encountered on Death Worlds. And her voice carried satisfaction that came from seeing plans succeed. We learned from fighting ourselves, she replied, that the side willing to break conventional rules usually wins. So we designed our entire doctrine around being unpredictable and adaptive. The battle raged for 18 hours and human casualties mounted as Vrax forces adapted to initial tactics. But every time the swarm developed countermeasures, the humans shifted approach and introduced new weapons or strategies. Human Marines boarded Vrax command ships and fought through organic corridors, using weapons specifically designed to target bioship vulnerabilities, and they moved with coordination that suggested telepathy, but was actually brutal. Training a human captain named Chen, grandson of the original ambassador, commanded a destroyer that took critical damage during a Vrax assault. And instead of retreating, he ordered his ship on a ramming course toward the largest enemy vessel for Earth and the Council. He transmitted on all frequencies while his ship accelerated toward impact. And classical music filled the communication channels as human tradition dictated going down. Fighting the destroyer struck the Vrax command carrier, and both ships vanished in an explosion that registered on sensors across the battle space. But Chen's sacrifice disrupted swarm coordination long enough for other human ships to exploit the gap. Thaxis felt his warrior spirit stir with recognition and understood what made humans so terrifying in combat. Because they approached death not with fear but with defiant rage, and they smiled while charging into situations that would break most species. The Vrax began retreating after losing 30% of their forces, something that had never happened in their conquest of 17 galaxies. And the human fleet pursued relentlessly while broadcasting their victory across Council channels. News of the human triumph spread through galactic civilization faster than hyperspace communication should allow, and species that had been preparing for extinction suddenly found hope in stories about the protected species that had built weapons in secret. The Council called another emergency session, and this time the chamber buzzed with excitement rather than desperation. And delegates transmitted questions about human capabilities and availability. And Zhang appeared before the Council with Thaxis, standing beside them as witness to human combat effectiveness. And the atmosphere had shifted from barely controlled panic to cautious optimism. The question before this council, the Vex representative pulsed in colors that indicated careful analysis, is whether humanity can sustain this level of combat effectiveness across multiple engagement zones. Zhang responded with diplomatic precision while displaying holographic projections that showed human fleet deployments across 17 strategic positions. And the numbers made Several delegates transmit shock. Earth's population currently exceeds 15 billion, he explained. And our mandatory service policy means every human receives combat training and can be mobilized if necessary. So we possess depth that species with smaller populations cannot match. The Thelrosi representative gurgled a question about human willingness to sustain casualties, because most species became demoralized after losing small percentages of their forces. And Zhang's response demonstrated something fundamental about human psychology. We will fight until the Vraks are defeated or humanity is extinct, he stated flatly. Because we learned from our history that surrender to an implacable enemy achieves nothing except dying on your knees instead of standing. The Council voted unanimously to grant humanity full combat deployment authorization and requested Earth assume coordination of defensive operations, and Rodriguez accepted with the same calm professionalism as she had displayed throughout over the following months. The human fleet demonstrated capabilities that rewrote Council understanding of warfare, and they introduced tactics that seemed impossible until they were executed successfully. The Battle of Proxima Threshold. Human forces defended a critical junction against Vraks numbers that outnumbered them 50-1, and they held through sheer determination that bordered on insanity. Ships that lost weapons became battering rams and crews that lost ships commandeered escape pods as improvised attack craft, and humans sang battle songs while dying in vacuum. And the VHX couldn't comprehend enemies who fought harder when Laws and Thaxis participated in the battle commanding Kryn cruiser alongside human destroyers. And he witnessed firsthand what made humans effective, because they simply refused to accept defeat even when defeat seemed inevitably. Human soldier named Martinez held an engineering section alone after his squad was killed, and he maintained power to shields for 6 hours while bleeding from multiple wounds. And when rescued, he apologized for letting the Vraks damage his station. Your species is insane. Thaxis transmitted to Rodriguez after the battle, his tone mixing horror and admiration. And you approach warfare like it's a personal insult that must be avenged through absolute commitment. Rodriguez laughed, and the sound carried genuine amusement mixed with acknowledgement of truth. And she explained what Thaxis was observing in terms he could understand. We're not insane, Commander. She corrected gently. We're just really good at being angry. And we channeled that anger into fighting harder than anyone expects. Within 6 months, the Vraks were in full retreat, and within a year, they fled the galaxy entirely. And Council species celebrated survival while simultaneously processing what human capabilities meant for future galactic politics. Final Council session to address the VARC's crisis became a ceremony honoring fallen warriors, and representatives from every species stood to recognize humans who had died defending civilizations. They barely knew Ambassador. Zhang accepted the honors with appropriate humility while mentally calculating how humanity's new status would reshape galactic power structures. And he caught Rodriguez's eye across the chamber. They had revealed Earth's strength, and now came the harder task of proving humans could be trusted with that strength. But Zhang felt confident because humanity had spent 50 years preparing for this moment.